Hello and welcome to Single Pair Radio. I'm Paul Hoppe, broadcasting on the WFMP 106.5 Forward Radio Community Network in Louisville, Kentucky, where news, information, and entertainment is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The views and opinions expressed on our show are those of the speakers and not the station. Single Pair Radio is a project of Kentuckians for Single Pair Healthcare in conjunction with Physicians for a National Health Program through its Kentucky chapter. We produce this program because we believe healthcare is a human right. We advocate for a national, not-for-profit, publicly funded, single-payer healthcare system. Simply explained, it's Medicare for all, only enhanced to cover dental, vision, hearing, and prescriptions, starting at birth and covering everyone. Catch our program at 2 p.m. Monday, 7 a.m. Tuesday, and 11 a.m. on Wednesday. We also stream our show on SoundCloud so you can listen anytime. This radio station relies on volunteers like myself and your ideas and donations to keep us on the air. Today, Drs. Mike Flynn and Gene Shively join me as co-hosts, and our focus is on gun violence in the community. So let's jump right in. Dr. Flynn?
Hi, this is Michael Flynn, retired surgical oncologist from the University of Louisville. Let me begin with the usual disclaimer. Any comments I make represent my personal views and do not represent the views of the Department of Surgery or the University of Louisville. Our topic today is gun violence as a public health issue, and we have a special guest, Keith Miller from the Trauma Service at the University of Louisville Hospital. Now, before we do that, I am going to make a second disclaimer. I am a lifelong Republican, and I am a gun owner, and I am a retired naval officer. I spent 2 years on active duty and 18 years in the reserves. And during that time, I had weapons training and received marksmanship awards from the M16 and the 45 and 9mm semi-automatic handgun. Now, the reason I'm making this disclaimer is that I don't want to get labeled as a radical left pinko communist when I consider myself a political moderate. So having said that, let me introduce our special guest. Keith Miller is a professor in the Division of General Surgery in the U of L Surgery Department. He's on the Trauma Service, went to medical school at the Indiana University, did a general surgery residency at the University of Louisville, a fellowship in surgical critical care, and he has been on this program one or two times in the past talking about this important issue. Gene, do you want to make a comment before we give Keith the floor?
Yes, sir. My name is Eugene Shively. I'm a retired rural surgeon in Campbellsville, Kentucky. And I would like to point out that anything I say does not reflect the opinion of the University of Louisville or Taylor Regional Hospital. I'm also a gun owner, but I hardly ever use them. And but I have in the past hunted, and I'm consider myself a moderate as far as politics and guns.
Keith, we appreciate your willingness to come and talk about this important issue. For our listeners, and you correct me if I'm wrong, it's my understanding that 40,000 to 45,000 people die in this country every year from gun violence, and it is the major cause of death of children, which is an astonishing fact. We are going to give you an opportunity, as we have done with all of our previous guests, to make whatever comments you'd like to make for as long as you'd like to make them, and then Gene will begin the conversation. So, Dr. Miller, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you for the invitation to be here first. I think I would include the same disclaimer that you all have. This is an emotionally charged issue and one where I think we have to apply an organized way of thinking about this to make progress. And so I think any summary comments that I would have would sort of echo what we've said prior in these episodes. I mean, this is a public health crisis in our country. Gun violence, it's a public health issue. You can't overemphasize that, and we can talk about why that's an important distinction as we move through the conversation. But you have to apply a public health approach to this issue, and that can't be overemphasized. The question you oftentimes get is, does it warrant that sort of widespread approach? Is the scope of the problem big enough to do that? And the answer is absolutely. In our country, gun violence is, as you alluded to, overtaken motor vehicle accidents as the leading cause of trauma-related years of potential life lost in the United States. And in Louisville is no different from that. We've talked in the prior discussion about how we lost more years of potential life to gun violence in our city than we did COVID-19 during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. This isn't to say that any year of life lost is any more important, but what it emphasizes is that with this particular problem, we are losing young people. And in fact, in the United States, sometime around 2017 or 18, years of potential life lost to firearm deaths was higher than any other traumatic cause for the entire population. And that's a staggering number when you think about it. The public health approach is essential. Obviously, this is a complex issue. We talked about the emotionally charged nature of it. We want one single solution. We want the one thing that's going to solve this for us, and that's just not how this is going to work because of the complexity of the issue. There's no single policy revision or program that will solve this. It permeates all levels of our socio-ecological continuum. And then when we think about that, we're talking about individual level risk factors all the way to societal risk factors. And so when you think about this issue or try to organize solutions, I think a Swiss cheese model that I think most of your listeners are familiar with, you try to build layers, protective layers on top of each other. And each layer is meant to prevent an injury down the line. What are those layers here? I mean, I think we talked about a few of them, whether you're talking about cure violence initiatives or group violence intervention, hospital-based violent interventory programs. We could talk about all those. That, in conjunction with some policy revision, is probably going to build those layers. That's sort of some introductory comments I would make, and we can take this conversation a million different directions depending on where you all want to go.
All right, Gene, do you want to start the ball rolling?
Yeah, I want to bring up an issue that most people don't think about. Is we talk about homicides all the time, but how does the number of homicides compare to the number of suicides from gun violence? And why is this so important?
Yeah, I think, suicides or intentional self-inflicted injury by firearm accounts for the majority of the deaths that we see in the United States. And that has been consistent over as long as statistics have been compiled. Why is that? Well, because there is a high case fatality rate, meaning the number of people that suffer an injury by self-inflicted firearm, the number of people that suffer that injury, and you take the numerator, the number of people that die from that injury, it's super high. So if you decide to take your life by firearm, there is a high mortality rate associated with that. When you look at homicide or firearm injury, interpersonal violence, you're looking at about a 20% fatality rate, so 1 in 5. It's much higher for suicide. If you look at suicide, certainly it sort of permeates the rural-urban divide. Doesn't matter where you're at in our country. Suicide by firearm is seen sort of throughout those areas and not confined to population density, high population density areas and things along those lines. So certainly 55 to 60% of the deaths by firearm are going to be related to self-inflicted injury.
Well, let me ask a follow-up question about that. Now, I retired in 2018 and had gone to a surgical grand rounds, I can't remember, maybe 2 or 3 years before. And I don't remember whether you gave the grand rounds or it was Ben's. It was one of the two of you. one of the things I learned was the main gun cause of death in the west end of Louisville were young black men shooting each other, and the main cause of death of guns in the east end of Louisville were middle-aged white male men killing themselves. Now, is that still true, or is that?
No, there's certainly racial and ethnic disparities that you see, and we could talk about a variety of factors that contribute to those disparities that you see. But as you look across Kentucky, by and large, suicide will account for the majority of firearm deaths when you take Kentucky as a whole. As you focus in the larger cities, you will see that shift towards interpersonal violence and homicide. That is still true today, not only in Louisville, but if you look at Cincinnati or you look at Indianapolis or Memphis, I mean, I think you'll see many of those same disparities as you focus in on that urban-rural divide that we sort of see.
So one more follow-up question on that. If you look at Louisville over, I don't know, whatever time frame you're thinking about, whether it's 5 years, 10 years or so, is the issue of gun violence going up, going down, or essentially remaining the same?
Yeah, so a lot of that depends on how far you pull out. I mean, in 2021, something changed in conjunction with the COVID pandemic where we saw record levels of homicide and firearm injury. I mean, we were up over 1,000 during that time period here at University of Louisville's Trauma Center. And you're talking about, for the first time, we were over 100 homicides in Louisville, Kentucky. We have not really gone down below that number. However, if you look at the last couple of years, there have been incremental decreases over that time. So we peaked 2021, 22, and now we've started to come down over the last couple of years, but it remains a significant issue.
Well, why do you think that happened? What happened during COVID to increase gun violence, particularly homicide?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as you look at, it's hard to do on an audio podcast, but as you look at sort of the socioecological contributors that put populations at risk for interpersonal violence, you're talking about many of the things that the same pressure was applied to as a result of the COVID pandemic. You talk about socioeconomic differences; disparities became substantially more pronounced during the COVID pandemic, and so I think all those pressures that are sort of overlapped or concentrated in similar populations became exacerbated during the pandemic. There's a lot of speculative reasons as to why that, but I think that's the predominant sort of theory, is that all those pressures sort of overlapped on similar populations and it resulted in increased interpersonal violence across those areas.
Well, if I remember correctly from one of your previous programs, and something that Jason Smith said when he was here, is that the trauma service has a program. They're working with West Louisville in an attempt to reduce reduce violence, not just gun violence. Would you kind of give us an overview of that for our listeners so that they understand what's going on, how this is working, and what interaction you're having with folks out in the West End?
Yeah, so I think as we talked about in the introductory comments, you want to build layers, and some of those layers have to be provided from a community level, right? And then you build those individual and interpersonal pieces outside, but the community level of support does seem to be protected. And so at University of Louisville, we do see it as our responsibility that we help contribute to some of these things. So there's multiple layers that we are trying to contribute to. Certainly the city, through what used to be the Office of Safe and Healthy Neighborhoods, that brand has since changed to the Office of Violence Prevention. We've got a program with them that has been around for 7 or 8 years now, maybe longer, that was under the conceptual design of a cure violence program, which means that as patients come into our hospital, there is a teachable moment or a vulnerable period of time where if those patients, as victims of firearm injury, are surrounded by potential resources that may be otherwise lacking, that they can change direction after an event like that. So we've got some community health worker team that comes in. They do a needs assessment. They say, what on this socioecological continuum can we help provide through facilitating city resources in order to prevent this from happening again. The city obviously is a huge part of that, because you have to have those resources to connect them to on the back end, which that's been sort of filled out over time, but requires a continuous sustainable investment from the city itself. So there's that piece, and that's sort of the cure violence model, which many of your listeners may or may not be familiar with. I think GVI is active in our city. We have a lesser role in that. And then the final piece is, as you talk about building community layers, is the Future Healers program. And that's something that started in 2020 through a partnership with Christopher 2X Game Changers, which is a nonprofit organization that's been active in this space for decades. And the idea is that we build a community layer of support and provide some infrastructure in order to provide children, that 4 to 13-year-old age group was what we initially targeted, a supportive environment. The model really is violence reduction through improved general health and well-being. So what we do is the second Saturday of every month, kids come to University Hospital. We've also had partners like the Galt House. We've had partners with Louisville Fire, with multiple community partners throughout the city. And they come in and teach lessons. I mean, it's not all about, hey, here's conflict resolution or here's, we're going to talk about gun violence today. It's about nutrition, it's about fire safety, it's about initial steps, stop the bleed training. It's about, so what started as sort of a firearm injury prevention program has now turned into creating opportunities and for children in our city to see that healthcare, careers and opportunities are something that are out there for them. And so we've had nurses, doctors, we've had people from across the spectrum of healthcare come in and spend time with these kids. It started as 25 kids. Now we've had over 150 come in through the program. And then the next layer that we've built is an educational component we partnered with JCPS. So we moved into 3 schools in Jefferson County, and there's a physical education, a PE component, and then a classroom component where we come in and talk about some of these same issues. This is really a program that the medical students are very active in. They help to develop the curriculum. It allows them an opportunity to work with the community and make positive change there. And so that's a big picture overview. I think maybe that doesn't make as much sense, and we can go into details as needed, but the program has now moved to Bardstown, Kentucky. So the principles apply no matter if you're in Louisville, Kentucky, or in Bardstown, Kentucky.
I've actually talked to some people about expanding some of that in Campbellsville, but haven't gotten anywhere. But I would like to know how that's funded. Do you get any federal money, and is the federal money in risk of being cut off?
Yeah, so I think it started as funding from internally through University of Louisville Health, and then Christopher 2X Game Changers provided some of the funding, but now it's grown to, we've had multiple funding streams as it's grown in sort of impact through the Department of Justice. The Project Safe Neighborhoods has been a major contributor over the years, which has been fantastic, allowed growth and expansion of the program. Safe States Alliance has been another one, and the Community Foundation of Louisville. So all those groups have helped to build pieces. I don't know where we cut off as far as what we were talking about, but there's the 4 to 13-year-old age group that we have the monthly sessions here in downtown Louisville at the University of Louisville or Jewish Hospital. There's the JCPS component where we're working into the curriculum at JCPS. There's the Bardstown component. And then we've also built the next phase, which is the Future Healers intern program, where many of the kids that were initially through the program, we've been going long enough, some of them have now moved on to this phase, which is really high school, post-high school, and what happens is They continue to intern and shadow in the hospital setting and eventually sign contracts with U of L Health to become permanent employees. So now we've covered the age from 4 all the way to 19 or 20 where they can start to find jobs in the healthcare space. And so the growth of it's been amazing. And it's a testament to the partners that have been involved. It's a testament to the energy of the medical students. Chris Jones with the transplant division, who you guys all know well, has been a big part of this and the growth that's happened there. And so, yeah, the funding has grown with the program. Certainly, as as things change, which is the only consistent thing you can count on, those funding streams, I don't know if they'll be around years from now or not, but we're continuing to try to find ways to make this sustainable, because the commitment is we're going to run this as long as we can, because we've seen the positive impact that it's had.
Okay, I want to change the subject just a little bit. It's astounding that the leading cause of death among kids is gunshot wound violence. It's just unbelievable. I'd like to ask, how do these kids get killed? Are the gangs shooting at each other, teenagers killing each other, or children getting caught in the crossfire, or are their parents killing them? What's the data on how these kids get shot and killed?
Well, the short answer is the data is not very good on any of that. I think, a lot of it's anecdotal. You will find some studies out there that try to attribute it to one subset of interpersonal violence or not. But all of the above is true, Dr. Shively. I mean, there are unintentional accidental injuries to bystanders. There's, certainly unintentional injury in that very young age group. As you look to that 0 to 2 to 3 to age group, a lot of those, playing with firearms that are not properly stored certainly is a big problem in the very young age group. As you move towards adolescence, there you're looking at more of group violence issues. Certainly when you look at statistics based on this, usually what they'll tabulate are injuries and fatalities under the age of 18. But as you pointed out, that's a very heterogeneous group, right? The risk a 5-year-old has to firearm injury or death is substantially different than that of a 14 to 15-year-old. So you'll see accidental and unintentional injuries in the early group, and as you move towards adolescence, you're seeing more group violence, which is the point of the initiative, the group violence intervention, which is being rolled out in many places. That's sort of the point of that, is to get to the heart of that. But yeah, so you're right. All of those potential contributors are active in the United States.
Well, I want to I want to get into what I think is the key issue here, and it's been interesting. I've listened to a couple of podcasts, in anticipation of the program, and at least in my opinion, there's a lot of tiptoeing around the real issue, and I'd like to get into this in a little bit, is gun control. I mean, the access to firearms in this country, in my opinion, is just it's insane. Kentucky is a permitless carry state, and the way I understand that, anyone over 21 can purchase a gun without any training, carrying it open or concealed, and I mean, that's just one small example. The old National Bank shooting, where this young man who had some mental issues went into a gun store, got an AR-15, which is basically an M16 without the automatic component, and then shot a bunch of people before they killed him. Other first world or developed countries have dealt with this issue. So, Keith, I'd be kind of curious. I know this is one of those political issues that nobody in Kentucky wants to talk about. Gordon Tobin, before he passed away, asked me to go to a KMA committee meeting in which they were talking about issues that the KMA might put before the legislature about guns. And Gordon talked about some of the issues and proposed a number of suggestions for the committee. I talked about the kind of injury that an assault weapon will cause on the human body. And then a guy stood up and talked about the rural culture in Kentucky about and made it sound like the AR-15 was essentially what the old 22 single shot rifle used to be back when I was a kid. So anyhow, I'd kind of like to hear your thoughts about it. You're picking up the pieces from all this stuff, and where do you think we should be with the gun control issue?
Well, I think, as you said, you talked about one particular piece, which is permitless carry. Those have changed over time in Kentucky. But I think if you want to have this conversation, first of all, every state is different, right? I think you need to understand the landscape in order to address some of these issues. And we're not talking about small differences. We're talking about major differences from state to state. Certainly, Kentucky's on the less restrictive end of the spectrum. I mean, I think no matter where you're at, the first thing, if you're interested in this issue, is to go find out what your state laws are. And there are databases that have that. Certainly, the RAND Corporation has put together a state-based firearm policy outline or sort of draft, so you can familiarize yourself with this. But really, it comes down to, when you talk about firearm policy, you're talking about who, what, when, and how. The who is how old do they have to be? Do you have to have background checks? The what is kind of what you're talking about, Dr. Flynn, which is what types of firearms should be available. Assault rifles, high-capacity magazines, those are under particular scrutiny. The when is, can you use your firearm during crises? This kind of speaks to some of the red flag laws that certain states have. And then the how is, how do you acquire a gun? How are they transferred? How are they bought? Or are there loopholes in how they're bought? So it becomes a really complex milieu of policy that, if you want to start chipping away at these things, you have to understand the landscape. I think one of the first studies, or a recent study that we did, was to try to understand the landscape of what's being used in Louisville, Kentucky. Is that translatable to anywhere else? Maybe, maybe not. But and we do have acoustic gunshot detection system in Louisville, Kentucky. And what that does is, it's a series of microphones across about 6 square miles in Kentucky that has expanded a bit, but it picks up the acoustic signature of a round fired. And now there's a certain level of, law enforcement and EMS deployment that goes when those actions are triggered. But in looking at this, the numbers are truly astounding when you think about what the exposure is in Louisville, Kentucky. So we're talking about 6 square miles, which is less than 2% of the geographic distribution of Jefferson County. And over a 4-year period, there were 55,000 shots or rounds fired during a 4-year period in 6 square miles. And we looked at it, as you looked over the study period from 19 to 23, what you saw was a couple big changes. You saw the acoustic signature can pick up an automatic versus a semi-automatic or a non-automatic weapon being fired, right? Because the acoustic detection or the acoustic signature sounds dramatically different. And if you've ever fired an automatic weapon, you know that, right? It sounds different. There's a lesser time interval between the rounds that are fired. And what we saw was really almost no automatic weapons in Louisville, Kentucky around 1819, and a shift towards almost 7 to 10% of the shots fired in Louisville, Kentucky came from automatic weapons in 23. So there's been a dramatic change in what's fired. Now, you can tease that apart even further, because from a policy perspective, automatic weapons, the legality of automatic weapons hasn't necessarily changed over that time period. So are these machine guns that are going all over the city of Kentucky? No, they are not. What this is modified 9mm handguns that you have a Glock switch or you have an auto sear, whatever you want to call them, but you modify a weapon that you can readily obtain and turn it into an automatic weapon. So that's what we've seen in Louisville over that time period.
We were talking about the number of shots, 55,000 rounds in a 6-year period. Now, give us a little idea what the average day in that 6 square miles in West Louisville is like. How many shots are being fired in an average day, I guess, or night? Do we have any idea? Or I guess we can figure it out, but.
Yeah, you're making me do math on the fly in an audio podcast, but divided by 1,400, let's see. I mean, you're talking about, 40 shots fired in a 6 square mile radius over the course of any single day, and I hope my math's right. But the other question that we have, which I have wanted to answer for a very long time and found to be super interesting, is of the shots fired, what percentage hit somebody? So that's where the actual study started. Was I wondered what the exposure is, and then how does that translate to injury? And so obviously we have this 6 square mile radius, and then we had Matt Ruther, who's with the School of Urban and Public Health, who was able to map every injury that we've seen through the database. And you're able to actually find the number of injuries per those 55,000 shots fired. And then what it translates to is that about 1.7% of those 55,000 shots fired resulted in an injury, which is a fascinating number, really. I mean, if you go back to, and Dr. Flynn, you can comment on this, but when you look at the number of shots fired per injury or fatality in many of the geopolitical conflicts or wars that we've talked about through history, the number's really high. A lot of shots fired to result in one fatality or one injury when you're talking about geopolitical conflict or war. And here in the civilian population in Louisville, you're talking about 1.7, almost 2% of the shots fired resulted in an injury. And just less than 1% resulted in a death. So that's an interesting number, and I think out of the study, it was one of the first studies to suggest what the correlation is between the number of shots fired and the number of injuries and fatalities in an urban area like Louisville, Kentucky.
Now, do we have any idea? Are these shots fired? Is somebody just shooting off in the air, celebrating, or?
That's a great question, Dr. Shively. So there is a lot of that, what we call celebratory gunfire, right? So we took out July 4th, we took out December 31st, January 1st. So we did pull 4 or 5 dates out where it does seem to look like, based on the shots fired activity, that a lot of that celebratory gunfire. The only thing this acoustic signature tells you is that it was a shot fired outside. So it doesn't pick up indoor firearm use, and so that number is the number of shots fired in the outside environment over that time frame. That's a great question.
Now, I when I was in a fellowship many years ago in Houston at the MD Anderson Hospital, I spent 2 New Year's Eves down in Houston. And if you've ever gone to Houston, I don't know if it's like that now, but it was back in those days. It was like the beginning of World War I. People were out in the street firing weapons off left, right, and center. And every now and then, one of these bullets had come down and hit somebody. I mean, it was absolutely crazy. So, anyhow, let me move us around a little bit in this very same vein, but now it's my understanding, in all fairness, I didn't kind of look this up, but in the ideologic wisdom of the Kentucky State Legislature, and I think the Supreme Court, the legislature can prevent, and which is what I think they've done here. Louisville cannot put together any sort of regulation or laws controlling access to guns or whatever firearms are available or anything like that without permission from the legislature. And I don't, as a Keith, is that something you've got any awareness of? Because
yeah, I mean, I think in general, the federal government has left it to the states to decide what those rights are when it comes to this particular issue. And I think certain municipalities have maybe found loopholes one way or the other to initiate their own policy, but in general, it's left at the state level and not the municipality level.
Let me ask a question about open carry. A lot of my friends and acquaintances believe that if you allow citizens to carry guns, that prevents crime, and if some criminal starts shooting at someone or at a shootout in a mall, that saves people's lives, and that it also open carry prevents crime. Is there any data to show that open carry affects crime and deaths?
Yeah, so that coin has two sides, I think, and I think, because what you're looking at, because the next question would be, do stricter state laws influence the number of injuries and fatalities from a firearm perspective? So what I would say is the data there is all associative data, right? Like, it's very hard to demonstrate causation in studies like that. By that, I mean that there does seem to be an association between a more restrictive policy environment and fewer firearm injuries and fatalities. But that is an association. It's very hard to determine causation there. And the same is true to answer your question, Dr. Shively. There's no strong, convincing data out there to suggest that what you said is true. However, I would say that, developing a study design to answer that question, as you can imagine, is very difficult.
Now, it's my understanding, and I guess I can stand to be corrected, but states like California and Massachusetts that have more restrictions on access to guns, and I don't know all the details, but there's enough. But the result of that is there are less firearm deaths, less firearm injuries, and less firearm events. Now, is that a reasonably fair statement? Does either of you have a view about that, or Paul?
Absolutely. I think what you'll see is there is an association. I think what you could say scientifically, which is where you try to separate emotion from discussing this issue, is that states with more restrictive firearm policy are associated with fewer firearm injuries and fatalities. I think that's a safe statement. Now, again, causation is a little bit more difficult to ascertain. And as we talked about, a state may be more restrictive in one subset of firearm policy and less restrictive in another when compared to another state. And so it gets pretty messy when it comes to that. So I think as we talk about this issue, I think you have to be precise in what type of firearm injury you are trying to address, right? Gun violence is this huge umbrella with multiple subsets. The the analogy I use is cancer. there are subsets within cancer, and if you try to develop a treatment plan for a certain type of cancer, that might involve radiation, and surgery may play no role. Whereas another type of cancer, surgery may be the mainstay, and these other things. The same is true of firearm injury if you want to break it down into those subsets. The same restrictive laws that apply to reducing interpersonal violence may actually do very little to reduce suicide by firearm. So I think as you look at what the problem is and try to define what the problem is, then you can try to develop the policy that would individually address that particular problem. And we can go into that a little bit more or not, but I think if you look at interpersonal violence from a domestic violence perspective, or interpersonal violence which involves two people that know each other maybe intimately, red flag laws, those sorts of things may be applicable to that, and less so to other types of interpersonal violence, if that makes sense.
Well, yeah, but the only issue is that every other developed first world country has put together an assortment of laws regulating different, and it's all different things are going on in different countries, but the end result of all this, now Switzerland, for example, is a gun-friendly country since the day of Napoleon. And most of the males in Switzerland are a part of the Swiss Defense Force, and they have a rifle in their closet. If you want to buy a gun in Switzerland, you go through a process of background checks, of interviews, of training, and you can't walk into a gun store and buy an AR-15. You can buy one gun, and then if you want to buy another one, another type of gun, you go through the same process again. And the gun violence rates in Switzerland are a fraction of ours, including the suicide. The suicide rates are higher, and they are in most other countries. But still, it's a fraction of what goes on here. Scandinavian countries, the European Union, UK, nobody has gun violence rates that are even close to ours.
Yeah, so I can give you some numbers for that if it's helpful to a listener, just to give an idea of where we're at relative to the rest of the world. In 2023, you talk about a 13.7 gun deaths in the United States per 100,000 people. So keep that 13.7 number. Now, that includes, 2/3 of those are 60% of those are suicides and 20% of those are homicides. So 13.7 total. If you look at Canada, you're looking at 2.1, Australia 1.0, France 2.7, Germany 0.9, Spain 0.6, right? And so those numbers are all substantially lower than 13.7. So, we register somewhere around 19th or 20th highest in the world. You've got El Salvador at 39.2, Venezuela at 40, Guatemala at 30, around about. So there are places that have higher incidence of firearm injury, but when you look at us relative to other, what they call Human Development Index or HDI, based on the United Nations countries, we are an outlier. There's no doubt.
Let me ask you a question. If you carry a gun, are your chances higher or less than being shot?
I think, if you want to answer that scientifically, it's very difficult. I will say that firearm exposure is a risk factor for firearm injury, I think. And so if you're in an environment where there is not a firearm, for example, your risk of firearm injury should be as low as it can possibly be. So although I don't have a study to quote, to suggest that or to validate that intuitively, that would be your exposure is a risk factor.
This is kind of a weird story. It goes way. I'm dating myself, but when I was in medical school in the late '60s, we had a few of us had a rotation through anesthesia. They were always short on people anesthesia residency, so they allowed us to rotate for 3 months. And the anesthesia actually had guns in the operating room to protect themselves. I won't mention any names.
Yeah, I know who you're talking about. he carried it around in his briefcase.
Right. So one of my fellow students thought that was pretty cool, so he bought a gun. And for some reason, he went down to the West End, and some dude took it away from him. I'm surprised that some dude didn't kill him or shoot him, but I'll never forget that story.
Well, listen, let's change. I don't want to change the subject. I just want to move it a little different direction. And again, I think this is one of the issues in this country that's not being dealt with. The gun industry is essentially unregulated. Mexico has one, I'm going to repeat this again, one gun store. The cartels have been armed by gun stores from Texas. The gangs in Haiti have been armed from guns coming from Florida. And, I don't know what it's going to take. I'm not asking, Keith, you don't have to I'm just I'm venting my spleen about this, because this is something that I think this country has got to, at some point, deal with, is that, the gun shows, people selling guns, they would go into these gun stores in Texas and buy 10 or 15 weapons, mostly assault weapons, put them in a truck or something, and drive over the border and sell them for 3, 4, 5 times as much in Mexico. And the cartels literally have military components that we've armed. So I don't know. I don't see that changing anytime soon. At least the good news is that the National Rifle Association seems to have disintegrated into a confused group of people who don't have the power that they used to have. So we'll see what happens.
Well, I guess the one, semi-relevant to that, I think, would be that, you talked about the association between fewer firearm injuries and more restrictive gun policy. What you'll also, by state, what you'll also see is sort of a proximity effect, which means that, and this alludes to the mobile nature of firearms in general, but you'll see that the states with more restricted, in the states surrounding a state with more restrictive policy, oftentimes they will have an association with a lower incidence of firearm injury as well, suggesting that what's happening in one state can impact, and we know this, what happens in one state can impact what's happening in the state that's adjacent to it. Now, you were talking about from country to country, but here I think it's worth noting that there is a proximity effect with policy that you'll see across our country.
Let me bring up another subject as something I don't think most people understand. Can you tell us a little bit about how many people you see a day at University Hospital who are being shot and don't die, and how busy you are and how much time that takes up? A little bit about the non-lethal gunshot wounds that Louisville has.
Yeah, so I think we are a level 1 trauma center. UK has an adult level 1 trauma center, and then Northern Children. So that accounts for the level 1 trauma centers in our state of Kentucky. Certainly, the next place you have to go is Indianapolis to the north, Nashville to the south, St. Louis to the west, and then Cincinnati to the east. And so I mentioned that just to say that the catchment area for trauma centers is pretty substantial. And so on a daily basis, what we see at the height of this in 2020, 2021, you'd see 2 to 3 a day. Now, that's not what we're seeing today. It's a bit less than that. And a lot of that's not all coming from Jefferson County, mind you, right? I mean, that's coming from the surrounding areas because the American trauma system is organized in a way where higher acuity injuries are funneled towards higher level trauma centers. So, in general, what has held true throughout the last 20 years, we can say confidently, because we've got pretty good data back to there, is the case fatality rate for being shot in an interpersonal violent incident is 1 in 5. I mean, it's 20%. The chances that you die as a result of your injury from interpersonal violence has stayed consistent through that time at 20%. So that means that 4 out of 5 injuries will not die as a result of their injuries immediately in that first initial hospitalization. Now, Dr. Flynn, Dr. Shively, you guys have both taken care of this situation clinically. You know that those injuries range from very minor soft tissue injuries to life-altering injuries, which result in a patient never really leaving a facility. If you talk about traumatic brain injuries, you're talking about spinal cord injuries. Some of those patients never get to the point where they can live on their own again. So it's a tremendous resource burden, to the state, to the city. But again, that's what we're here for. Those are the injuries that we come into work every day to deal with. And so, but you'd love to not have to deal with them from a resource utilization perspective. You've seen the numbers. I mean, they're tremendously costly, not only from that standpoint, but, a homicide costs somewhere around $1 million. If you look at some of these studies, and a non-fatal injury costs somewhere around $500,000, and so those numbers come from trying to take into account not only the law enforcement response, but the hospital response, plus the criminal justice system, which is a substantial portion of that, including incarceration when that's identified. And so that's a tremendous cost. All you have to do is the math. I talked about 1,000 injuries in 22 or in 2020. Do the math. If 20% of those are fatal, you're talking about a tremendous amount of money that has to go to addressing this issue.
Now, Keith, can you break down the frequency of high-velocity AK-47, M16, AR-15s compared to 22, 45, 38, and add a severity issue to each of those? And can you has anything changed over the past, say, 5 or 6 years?
Yeah, so as you know, it's very hard when you're in the operating room to determine what type of weapon was used. I mean, certainly, higher velocity injuries are going to have more destructive injuries, but a lot of that depends on where and, from what distance and all those factors. So it's been very difficult to determine. The majority of injuries are handguns, no doubt about it. If you look across the country in the urban environment in particular, the majority of the weapons being utilized are handguns. Until that study that I kind of just talked about, it was very difficult to, anecdotally you'd say, oh, it seems like more weapons are higher. We're talking about high capacity firearms, and we're talking about automatic weapons. But again, a lot of that just changes the number of shots that you can fire. It doesn't necessarily change the injury pattern. With the exception of each individual may have more holes than what they did 20 years ago. But so it's not that. It's very difficult to say X% are from 22s and X% are from 38s, because very rarely can you determine that based on the data that we have in the hospital. You guys okay?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Gene.
Okay. All right. That's all very interesting. When I was a resident, most of the gunshot wounds were 22s, and the bullets bounced around a lot. It's my understanding now we have a lot of injuries with really big holes and severely injured people. Is my concept of that true? That we're seeing more massive injuries than we used to from gunshot wounds?
I think what I would say is, it seems, or anecdotally it appears, that we are seeing patients which have more holes than what they used to. And
okay.
So that's a big problem, because, as you know, when you're trying to address a firearm injury operatively, hemorrhage control is priority number one. And so if you've got multiple potential sites of hemorrhage, then that adds to the complexity of what you're trying to do. So certainly, not to bore your listeners, but from an operative standpoint, damage control surgery is utilized regularly, almost, semi-daily basis here at the hospital. Damage control implies that really you're not completing the operation on the initial index presentation. You try to stage it to where you're addressing problems 1, 2, and 3, and then you put 4 and 5 on the back burner to address tomorrow or the day after. And as patients arrive with more holes, not only triaging the patient from an acuity perspective, but triaging which holes are the most likely to kill an individual and trying to address those first, and then, delaying some of the other stuff to later. So that has certainly become more and more common.
Now,
So you're saying that a patient comes in with a gunshot wound of the chest and the abdomen, it becomes very, very difficult to which to deal with first and how to treat those patients and how to operate on them.
Yeah, hemorrhage or bleeding remains by far the number one cause of preventable death in trauma. Bleeding remains the number one preventable cause of death in firearm injury. And so find the bleeding, right? And that's basically, if you had to boil my job down to a very simple description, it's find the bleeding, find the holes, control the bleeding, control the holes, and then try to reestablish function at a later date. But yes, absolutely. If you got a chest abdominal injury, multiple truncal injuries, and you guys know it's probably beyond the scope of this podcast, but you have windows into those body cavities where major bleeding could happen, and identifying that is of the utmost importance.
okay, guys, giving you the 3-minute warning. We're getting close to the end of the lollipop here. That mass school shooting in Connecticut, one of the families of some of the children that were shot with an AR-15 allowed not the pictures of the children, but images showing the injuries. The AR-15 has a high velocity, muzzle velocity, and a tumble. It makes a little small hole when it enters the body, but then there's this cavitation effect, which is really why this is a weapon of war. And there's a video showing the pictures of these awful injuries that happened to some of these children. Well, listen, we're getting close to the end of the lollipop. Keith, I want to thank you very much. We're going to give you an opportunity to make whatever last-minute comments you make, and then Paul's going to take us out.
No, I think, we've covered a wide array of stuff, and we've just touched the surface on all of it. Each of these issues you can dive into, and the complexity of this problem is beyond the scope of a 45-minute podcast. I'm always interested in knowing what people find interesting about this and what they don't, but what I will tell everybody is it is relevant to wherever you're at in the United States, whatever you do. I would say two things. This is an issue that's relevant, and it's a public health issue that impacts all of America. And so everyone having some baseline knowledge of this is important. And then the second piece that I'll say is, no matter what it is that you do in this world on a daily basis, there is an opportunity with this particular issue to make some positive change. And I think, we talked about some of the violent injury prevention programs that we're doing as far as future healing. You're seeing opportunities for people to insert themselves in young people's lives in a way that's very positive and life-altering for these people, regardless of what it is you do on a daily basis. And so I think, that would be what I would encourage people to do moving forward. And I guess that's how I'll end my soapbox.
And thank you again. You've been a great guest, Paul.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Miller. I really appreciate you taking the time to come on and share this valuable information. I wish we could get more people to listen to it, actually. But and those who are listening, thank you for tuning in, and please keep coming back to Single Payer Radio. Thank you.